everyone, I am here today with a long-awaited video on budgeting. We're well into the start of the new year and the new decade, so this is prime time to start tracking your finances and to start setting and meeting your budgets. If you've been following along with my channel, you'll know that I've recorded 2 previous finances videos, and I have rewatched these videos, and everything I said in those videos I still stand by today. So the first video was posted way back in 2015. It was on how to save money. I will link that video down below. The next video that I did was 3 years later in October of 2018. This was after I quit my job, and I posted a video on how I prepared financially for leaving work. My main point of advice in both of those videos was to start tracking your finances. If you haven't started yet, it's totally okay. Again, my advice would be to start today. So after you watch this video, I would think back on what you spent money on during the day. Just jot that down. You can use pen and paper. You can use a bullet journal, or you can use an app. There are tons of apps out there now that help you with your finances, or you can do what I do and build a customized spreadsheet. This video is going to focus on my spreadsheet, and in particular the budgeting tab of my spreadsheet. And building your own customized Excel spreadsheet is always my #1 recommendation. Even if you're not that familiar with Excel, you will get familiar with it as you play around with these numbers. It's really the best way to customize something to your particular needs, but of course an app is a lot easier, and that's a great way as well. Any way of tracking is better than not tracking at all. Some of you may be thinking, it seems like a lot of work to track your finances. I don't really see the point in tracking your finances, but if you have any sort of financial goal, and most of us do, tracking your finances and budgeting are going to help you get there. It can be any financial goal. You could be saving up to purchase something. Maybe you want to buy a handbag, or maybe you want to buy a condo or a house. Maybe you want to buy a car. Maybe you want to quit your full-time job, or maybe you want to retire early. These are all financial goals that can be helped along if you track your finances and if you set and meet a budget. While the main focus of this video is budgeting, you can't really have budgeting if you're not tracking your expenses. You won't know where to set your budget, and you also won't know if you've met your budget if you're not tracking your expenses. So the two really go hand in hand, and again, they form my #1 recommendation if you have any sort of financial goal. Before we jump into Excel, I just wanted to mention that the one thing that a lot of people tend to forget about budgeting is that where you set your budget matters. This is absolutely key. If you set your budget too high, you're always going to be under budget, and you'll think that you're doing very well in terms of your spending, but meanwhile, it's really because your budget was set a bit too high. If you set your budget too low, you're constantly going to be blowing your budget, and you're going to be feeling really down about your inability to meet your budget. So where you set your budget matters, and I highly recommend you set it at a realistic and appropriate level. The more realistic, the better, and the slower the adjustments over the years towards your financial goals, the more you'll be able to make lasting changes to your behavior. And again, this is where tracking your finances is so important, because if you don't know how much you're spending and where you're spending your money now, it's going to be really hard to set a budget for the following year that is realistic and appropriate for your circumstances. Let's go ahead and get to some concrete examples with budgeting. I'm going to switch to Excel now. Before I show you snippets of my own personal finance spreadsheet, I'd love for you to pause the video, jot down your own personal spending categories, as many as you can think of. These are the categories that you spend money in and that you'll track your spending in, and eventually you will budget for. There are no right or wrong answers, so just jot down everything that comes to mind. I know only some of you are going to pause the video and do this little exercise, but it is really helpful for you to think of your own personal spending categories, because we are all different. What I track is very specific to me, and I'm going to show you examples of my past history as well, so you can see how my own personal tracking has evolved over the years to suit my circumstances. It's perfectly fine to track something that you feel is important that someone else may not feel is important. Likewise, someone else might find something very important to track, and perhaps you don't agree, but that's perfectly okay as well. There's no judgment in this. This is only what suits your own situation best. This again is just a snippet of what I track, but these are all of the categories I currently track in my 2020 spreadsheet. You'll see at the top here it says personal, and that just basically means my own personal expenses. I also track my shared expenses with hubby. They are exactly the same categories because I wanted to be able to drag down formulas very easily, but that section is hidden. I can't emphasize strongly enough how important it is to cater the categories to your own personal situation. For example, you're going to see that we have a category for pets. If you don't have pets, you clearly wouldn't track this category. As well, my husband and I don't have children, so you're not going to see any expenses on this list that have to do with children's activities or clothing for children, diapers, that sort of thing. You'll also see that we don't have any rent or mortgage expenses. That's because we own our condo and we paid off the mortgage several years ago. I attribute a lot of that ability to pay it off so quickly to my tracking of finances and to my budgeting. The last thing that you'll notice here is that we don't have any expenses related to a vehicle. We don't own a car, and when we do need a car, we rent it. That saves a lot of money in terms of maintenance fees for the vehicle, insurance, that sort of thing. We do have this general bucket for transportation. This is where I put in the budget for car rental as well as public transit, or Uber, taxis, and the like, but we generally don't take those. I'm not going to run down the list one by one because you can just easily take a screenshot. You'll see I've color-coded a lot of the expenses here, and what I would advise is for anything that you are particularly passionate about, you may want to track it in more detail. I'm going to filter this list for my blue shaded cells. And as you can see, these are all my food-related expenses. I track 3 categories in the overall bucket of food, and you can see the descriptions on the side here. The last subcategory in this overall bucket is wine, and these are basically alcohol-related groceries, so any wine or beer or spirits and whatnot that we purchase to bring home. This doesn't include wine that we would drink at restaurants. I don't split out the restaurant tab. I would just put all of that in food. The reason it's helpful to track subcategories in things that you're truly passionate about is that in the event that you want to make a change down the road, you can adjust your spending slowly in each category. So for example, we used to go out to eat a lot. I didn't love how I was consistently over budget in the category of food, so that's when I started with the Eat at Home challenge. When we did the Eat at Home challenge, our expenses for food went way down. But what was really interesting to me is that our expenses for groceries didn't go up that significantly. So we were really able to move the needle in terms of our overall spending because we were able to reduce this number while keeping this number relatively the same, maybe just a little bit higher. So that's one example of tracking something that you're very passionate about in a little bit more detail. Now let's go ahead and look at my pink categories. These are all the categories that I have that relate to fashion. Handbags I split out because I had a past obsession with handbags. I actually still love all of my handbags. Finally, the green category is the newest to my spreadsheet, and you're going to see that as I show you a couple of spreadsheets from my past a little later on. These are 2 subcategories I started tracking in more detail when I started my YouTube channel. When I do my budgeting, what I do is I populate the annual number, and then the monthly number will calculate automatically. For example, if I budget $100 in accessories, that works out to about $833 a month. Of course, I don't really spend that every month. Maybe I might buy accessories once or twice a year, but I find it helpful to have this monthly number just to take a look at. The best way to populate the annual numbers is to have a history to look back on so you can see what you spent last year and adjust based on that. However, if you haven't started tracking your finances yet, I would recommend starting with any categories that are easy to track. So these are generally categories that you receive a bill for. For example, cable, for us this would be our internet. We get a bill for the internet, so we know how much we pay for the service. Let's just say we pay $50 per month. I would just take 50 and times it by 12. This will calculate automatically, and I used to put the monthly numbers in here, but some were annual numbers and some were monthly numbers, and I decided that this would be an easier way for me to track things going forward. So this may seem like a roundabout way, but it's actually more efficient for me. Now I'm going to go ahead and populate the other categories for which we get a bill, so I'm pretty confident about the amount that I'll be spending for the upcoming year. I've gone ahead and populated all of the expenses for which we receive a bill, so I know that we're going to be spending at least $10,000 as a couple this year. Normally, I would divide this by 2 because these are my personal expenses, but I'm just going to go with it. This is just an example anyway, and these aren't the real numbers. I just made them up based on what I could remember, but they're pretty close. So now I can go in and add in the budget numbers for all of the other different categories. Maybe I'm doing a no-buy this year, so I'm going to say 0 for accessories, $100 for basics in case I need socks or underwear. I'm going to say 0 for clothing. I'm going to say 0 for cosmetics, for handbags, for jewelry, for shoes. That's if I was doing a no-buy this year, which I am not, but again, this is just an example. Food and groceries are notoriously difficult to budget for. You probably spend more than you think on these categories. So if you don't have any history to call upon when you're trying to set the budget for the year, just try to think how many times you go out to eat in a month and multiply it by the average amount that you spend. So say I go out for dinner 5 times a month, once with my husband, a few times with different friends and such, and let's just say I spend $50 per meal. So I'm going to do $50 for myself per meal times 5 times a month times 12. That's already $3,000, but that doesn't include any other things that I might buy. Maybe I go to Starbucks and I buy a coffee. Maybe I do that once a week, but I like those fancy coffees, so maybe I do $7 per coffee times 52 weeks. Now we're at about $3,400, and maybe I buy some fast food every now and then. So maybe I go to a fast food restaurant once a week. I spend $10 at the restaurant, so again times 52. So now we're at about $4,000 for food. So I'm going to go ahead and just call it a day at $4,000, but that's how I would estimate it if I don't have history to call upon when I'm doing this number. Groceries is a little more difficult. You would have to think about how many times you go to the grocery store and on average how much you spend. So hubby and I go to Costco maybe 6 times a year. On average, we spend $200 to $300. So let's say $250 times 6. I also go to a regular grocery store maybe twice a week. On average, maybe I spend $50 a week, so $25 per trip. So I'm going to say $50 times 52. And we're at about $4,100. I think I'm going to call that a day as well and just say $4,000 for groceries. Another big category for us is, of course, pets. We have a dog and a rabbit, and generally we budget around $3,000 for them a year. We never hit that, but just in case there are emergencies or whatnot, I like to budget a little bit more in this category. Travel is another one that is very, very difficult to budget for. This year, hubby and I are planning one big trip, so I think I'm going to budget $5,000 for that. And again, this is just going to be my personal expenses. So here we have my personal expenses mixed in with shared expenses, so this really isn't right at all. But again, it is just an example. So there are a few other categories. I don't really buy books because I always go to the library. Crafts, I'm not really doing a whole lot of crafts, but sometimes I like to buy some like art supplies and such, so maybe I'll budget $100 there. I do like to budget something for donations in case someone sends me something to contribute to, so I'll put in $200 there. Education, I'm not planning to take any courses. Entertainment, again, this is such a huge range, but hubby and I don't really do that much by way of entertainment, just movies every now and then, sometimes sporting events, but I'm not really into live sporting events at the moment. Sometimes we do musicals and such, but it's really rare, so I'm gonna budget maybe $200 for that. Equipment is basically stuff for the home, so these are electronics like a TV or a laptop, as well as kitchen appliances, say the Instant Pot. I don't really have anything I want to buy in this category, although I am thinking about buying an air fryer lid for the Instant Pot, but I'm still thinking about that. So I'm going to budget $200 there. Gifts is another category where you'll be surprised how much you spend. So you'll want to factor in any birthdays that you celebrate with gifts, Christmas, that sort of thing. I'm going to budget $1,500 because that's around how much I spent last year. But again, this is going to vary so much depending on the amount of gifts you give, what type of gifts you give, etc., etc. There are just so many factors. Home expenses are furniture, bedding, flowers, anything for the home that you would, display. So these are decorative things as well, like picture frames and the like. I don't spend a whole lot in this category. I think you can probably tell by my videos, I'm not someone who really cares too much about my home environment in terms of the way it looks. As long as it's tidy, not cluttered, and clean, I don't really need to rotate stuff or like buy new things for the home all the time. But I do want to put in a budget for something, so maybe I will say $200 here. LW brand expenses, I do want to invest in myself this year. I only want a budget for a website, say like $20 a month or something along those lines. So maybe I'll put in $500 just so I have a little bit of a buffer in case I want to do something a little bit more beyond just a very simple website. Services, this would be like dry cleaning. When I went to get my nails done, I would put it in this category. Don't really anticipate much by way of services. Dry cleaning would be the only thing, so I'm going to budget $100. Supplies are things like household cleaners, light bulbs, candles. This again is kind of hard to budget for if you don't know how much you've spent in the past, but I think we're around $100 or $200 in this category, so I'll just leave it at $200. Toiletries, again, if you haven't been tracking in the past, it'll be very difficult to think of how much you spend in this area. I believe based on past expenses, we've only spent around $200 to $300 again in this category. So I'll just say, maybe I'll say $300. Transportation, we have our car rentals in here. We typically spend under $1,000 for car rentals for the entire year, and this includes gas. So maybe I'll put in $1,000. I'm taking the TTC more because of my part-time job. So I'm going to budget $50 a month for TTC. I think I spend less than that, but just in case. So we have $1,600 for transportation. And then other is just a general bucket that you may or may not want to put anything in. I'm going to put in $100 just in case I forgot something. So for the year, I have my personal budget set at $31,800. But again, this isn't really an accurate budget because I've got some shared expenses in here as well as some personal expenses. What I would typically do once I get my final number here, if I'm in a year where I want to save money, I'll tweak the categories to reduce that to $30,000. If it's a year where I don't mind spending a little bit more money to treat myself, maybe I'll add some budget to some categories to make it $35,000. A lot of videos on YouTube these days are talking about debt reduction and saving money. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to tweak the categories so that my overall budget for the year is $30,000. I don't want to go above $30,000 this year. So I'll just go through, and any discretionary expenses I will just adjust a bit. Maybe I'll try to do a more budget-friendly vacation and spend $4,000 instead of $5,000. I don't think I really need to spend anything on crafts. I have a lot of supplies at home and I don't anticipate I'm going to buy much this year, so I can reduce that number. Maybe I will reduce my food budget because there was a lot of Starbucks in there. I also bumped it up a little bit to round it to $4,000, so maybe I can go down to $3,500 here. If I cut out some Starbucks and maybe I make my lunch more often, I can reduce that a bit. I think health might be a bit overstated. $300 on vitamins is quite a lot, so I'll just reduce that to $200. Now I have to find $100 more. I think I can reduce home to $100 because, again, I really don't have a need for anything to spruce up the home at this point in time, unless we do renos, which would be a whole other thing. and we'd have no plans to do renos right now. So that's how I go ahead and I tweak my expenses to reach a certain amount that I want. And in this case, I wanted to reach a budget of $30,000. So that is $2,500 per month. The year-to-date numbers here are the actual spending. These are formulas that are calculated based on my other tabs. I'm not going to go into this here, but know that you need to track your expenses in order to see whether or not you have met your budget. So we're still early in the year. Say I've spent $100 on food. Maybe we've spent $250 on groceries already. I just bought a set of flannel bed sheets. That would be in my home bucket. So those were around $35. There are a few other things that we've purchased, call it $20. I purchased that matcha whisk, so say $10. So basically you would input all of your expenses that you've tracked, your actual spending, and you would put it in these categories. And the way you do that is up to you. For me, the easiest way is to track it all on a separate tab and then have formulas that link to this. But you could very easily just click on the cell and add in your expenses as you go. I just find that if you're doing a lot of transactions, it's easier just to track it on a separate tab. The main numbers you want to look at on this tab are your annual budget numbers, your monthly budget numbers, which are what you think you will spend during the year, as well as your actual spending, and this is year to date. So when you look at the 1%, it's not really that representative. This number is calculated as your year to date spending over your annual budget. So of course it is low at the beginning of the year because not much time has gone by. You're only comparing your expenses as of today, which is January 9th, when I'm recording this video, to a full year of expenses. This is part of the reason I have a separate summary tab that has a bit more information about how I'm actually doing in the year. But again, there are some caveats to using this data. There always are caveats to using data, so let's go ahead and talk about this quick summary. So the actual spending number you'll be very familiar with because that just pulls from the other tab. The months elapsed is basically how much of the year has gone by in terms of the number of months. So for example, if we're at the end of January, this number would be 1. At the end of February, this number would be 2, so on and so forth. Because we're in the first week of January, that's why it's showing 0.26. So basically a quarter of a month has gone by in the year so far on January the 9th. The budget number is a prorated number based on that $30,000. So if we take the $30,000 annual budget, divide it by 12 to get my monthly budget, and multiply it by the number of months that have elapsed, we get the prorated budget for the year. And again, if this were 1, my prorated budget would be $2,500 because that is my monthly budget. The important numbers to look at in this situation are the numbers that are highlighted in green. So a negative number means that I am under budget, and you can very clearly see that because my actual spending is less than my prorated expected spending for the year. And that's where I also get the 63%. It's just my actual spending divided by how much spending I was expecting at this point in the year. Let's say I forgot that I booked a flight. I have to go back to my budget numbers and add in my $1,000 flight that I just booked earlier this week. Now my spending has gone up to $1,415. When we look at the summary, you'll see now that I'm at 215% of my year-to-date budget, and I'm about $760 over budget. This is where there's another caveat. At the beginning of the year, any expenses that you pay at the beginning of the month, it's going to make your spending look worse than it is in terms of being over budget. So say I had to pay rent at the beginning of January, or say I had to pay a bunch of insurance premiums at the beginning of the year. That's going to throw off your numbers a little bit when you compare that to your year-to-date budget, because not enough time has gone by. You're prepaying a lot of expenses and the time hasn't caught up to that yet. Towards the end of the year though, this number should stabilize and you should have a good sense of whether or not you're going to be over or under budget for the year. At the beginning of the year though, it's going to fluctuate a lot. That's basically all I have to say about budgeting. I know the way I do things might be a little bit confusing, and that's why I highly recommend that you start tracking and start building your own spreadsheet in a way that is easy for you to keep up with and to understand. I mentioned a little earlier that I was going to show you some of my previous spreadsheets spreadsheets and categories and such. So let's go ahead and look at my pre-YouTube days. This was my spreadsheet in 2005. It's actually the earliest spreadsheet I have. I started tracking in either the year 2000 or 2001, but I can't find those versions anywhere. Back then, I would put in some monthly numbers and the annual numbers would calculate. But again, I just preferred a more streamlined approach where I input everything in the same column, so that's why it changed. Back then, I had a category called HBA, which was health and beauty type expenses. I also had a category called rent. I was already tracking food, groceries, and wine separately, but I didn't have it color-coded. I also didn't have personal up at the top because I only tracked my own expenses and not our shared expenses. This was before hubby and I got married. We also didn't have pets, so you don't see a category for pets back in 2005, but all of the other categories are relatively the same. Now let's fast forward to YouTube days and see what my expense categories look like in 2012. At this point in time, we had purchased a condo, so you see expenses related to interest on the mortgage, maintenance fees, occupancy fees, and property tax. I also still had rent in here because I hadn't deleted it out of my spreadsheet yet, but we were no longer paying rent. Actually, at this point in time in 2012, we had already paid off the mortgage as well, but I still had these categories in here because I hadn't removed them yet. The reason I don't have my mortgage payments in here is because I didn't see them as expenditures. I saw them as equity. I also had a photography business at the time, so I had expenses for photography. I still had HBA as its own separate bucket, so this is for cosmetics and toiletries. I had started color coding at this point in time. I had a different category for food versus dining. There's so many gray areas that I decided to consolidate them afterwards. My point being that over the years, I have changed this quite a bit to suit my needs. And the current iteration is, of course, my favorite because it meets my needs the most. But don't be afraid to tweak your categories. Don't be afraid to have your budget change as your situation changes. My expenses ballooned when I had a mortgage and also when we finished paying off the mortgage but had all this discretionary income to spend on other things. But when I decided to start living a more simple life and I cut back all of those expenses, my budget now is actually quite a bit lower than even like 2005 when I look back, which is incredible to me. The last thing I want to mention is I very rarely look at this column, which is basically the percentage of my budget column by category. Besides this column not having a whole bunch of meaning if you are early in the year, I also don't worry about the categories too much as long as my overall spending is in line. I'll basically look at this number and this number. That's what I track throughout the year. If I see that I am way over budget, I may go in and take a closer look at my individual categories, but otherwise, if my expenses are pretty reasonable, I'm at or very close to my budgeted numbers, I don't worry too much about the categories themselves. My main goal is to hit my $30,000 per year, irrespective of what happens in these categories. The only time I may make a change is mid-year if something about my situation changes. So say we got pets. I would add in a budget category for pets mid-year. Budgeting is as much art as it is science, so it's really important to be flexible and just have the budget reflect your circumstances. I'm going to put in one more situation where we are at the end of the year, and I've gone ahead and input, say, all my categories. You'll notice that if I'm over budget in certain categories, these numbers will automatically highlight, indicating that I'm over budget by more than 10%. So I can show you here as a pretty clear example. If I'm right on budget, I'll be at 100%. If I'm 10% over budget, I'll be at 110%. If I'm 11% over budget, this will highlight. This shows me what categories I missed the mark on, and then when I'm setting my budget for next year, I can try to do better in these categories. Maybe next year I need to up my food budget to $4,000 or $4,500 if you want to take into consideration inflation. There are so many things that you can think about when it comes to your finances, but the most important thing is to start. That is going to be it for my video on budgeting. Again, it goes hand in hand with tracking your finances. I hope you've gotten some ideas and have a little bit of motivation to get started today if you haven't started tracking your finances already. Once again, this video was very Excel heavy, but you can always track your finances using good old pen and paper, bullet journal method, or you can use one of the many apps that are available. If you do want to track using a spreadsheet, I would recommend customizing and building your own and just letting it evolve as you evolve as a person. If you are starting to track your finances today, know that there is a bit of effort and time commitment required at the beginning. It's hard sometimes to remember to track everything. Even now, sometimes I forget an expense here and there. But with time, it does get a lot easier and it becomes a lot faster as well. Thank you so much for watching this video. Again, I've done 2 other finances videos that I still stand strongly behind, and I will link those down below in case you're interested in watching more. If you have any other topics you'd like me to talk about, please again, leave me a comment. Judging by my track record on how often I record finances videos, I can't promise that I'll record a video right away, but I will answer the question that you leave in the comment section. So even if I don't get to a video right away, at least you'll have some sort of answer from me in the meantime. That is going to be it for me today. I will see you very soon in another video. Until then, please start tracking your finances, and as always, take care and bye for now.